Part 2 of Ball of Fat. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ball of Fat by Guy de Maupassant. Translated by M. Walter Dunn. Part 2. Read by Michael Robinson, Carbondale, Illinois. It is the first step that counts. The Rubicon passed, one lends himself to the occasion squarely. The basket was stripped. It still contained a pâté de foie gras, a pâté of larks, a piece of smoked tongue, some preserved pears, a loaf of hard bread, some wafers, a full cup of pickled gherkins and onions, of which Crudity's Ball of Fat, like all women, was extremely fond. They could not eat this girl's provisions without speaking to her, and so they chatted, with reserve at first, then, as she carried herself well, with more abandon. The ladies d'Iberville and Carré-Lamadon, who were acquainted with all the ins and outs of good breeding, were gracious with a certain delicacy. The Countess especially showed that amiable condescension of very noble ladies who do not fear being spoiled by contact with anyone, and was charming. But the great Madame Lousseau, who had the soul of a plebeian, remained crabbed, saying little, and eating much. The conversation was about the war, naturally. They related the horrible deeds of the Prussians, the brave acts of the French, and all of them, although running away, did homage to those who stayed behind. Then personal stories began to be told, and Ball of Fat related, with sincere emotion, and in the heated words that such girls sometimes use in expressing their natural feelings, how she had left Rouen. "I believed at first that I could remain," she said. "I had my house full of provisions, and I preferred to feed a few soldiers rather than expatriate myself to go I knew not where. But as soon as I saw them, those Prussians, that was too much for me. They made my blood boil with anger, and I wept for very shame all day long. Oh, if I were only a man! I watched them from my windows, the great porkers with their pointed helmets, and my maid held my hands to keep me from throwing the furniture down upon them. Then one of them came to lodge at my house. I sprang at his throat the first thing. They are no more difficult to strangle than other people, and I should have put an end to that one then and there had they not pulled me away by the hair. After that it was necessary to keep out of sight. And finally, when I found an opportunity, I left town, and here I am." They congratulated her. She grew in the estimation of her companions who had not shown themselves so hot-brained, and Cornudet, while listening to her, took on the approving, benevolent smile of an apostle, as a priest would if he heard a devotee praise God, for the long-bearded Democrats have a monopoly of patriotism as the men in cassocks have of religion. In his turn he spoke, in a doctrinal tone, with the emphasis of a proclamation such as we see pasted on the walls about town, and finished by a bit of eloquence, whereby he gave that scamp of a Badinguet a good lashing. Then Ball of Fat was angry, for she was a Bonapartist. She grew redder than a cherry, and stammering with indignation, said, "I would like to have seen you in his place, you other people. Then everything would have been quite right. Oh, yes, it is you who have betrayed this man. One would never have had to leave France if it had been governed by blackguards like you." Cornudet, undisturbed, preserved a disdainful, superior smile, but all felt that the high note had been struck, until the Count, not without some difficulty, calmed the exasperated girl, and proclaimed with a manner of authority that all sincere opinions should be respected. But the Countess and the manufacturer's wife, who had in their souls an unreasonable hatred for the people that favor a republic, and the same instinctive tenderness that all women have for a decorative, despotic government, felt themselves drawn, in spite of themselves, toward this prostitute so full of dignity, whose sentiments so strongly resembled their own. The basket was empty. By 10 o'clock they had easily exhausted the contents, and regretted that there was not more. Conversation continued for some time, but a little more coldly since they had finished eating. The night fell, the darkness little by little became profound, and the cold felt more during digestion made Ball of Fat shiver in spite of her plumpness. Then Madame de Breville offered her the little foot stove in which the fuel had been renewed many times since morning. She accepted it immediately, for her feet were becoming numb with cold. The ladies Carrère Lamadon and Lousseau gave theirs to the two religious sisters. The driver had lighted his lanterns. They shone out with a lively glimmer, showing a cloud of foam beyond, the sweat of the horses, and on both sides of the way the snow seemed to roll itself along under the moving reflection of the lights. Inside the carriage one could distinguish nothing, but a sudden movement seemed to be made between Ball of Fat and Cornudet, and Lousseau, whose eye penetrated the shadow, believed that he saw the big bearded man start back quickly as if he had received a swift, noiseless blow. Then some twinkling points of fire appeared in the distance along the road. It was Totes. They had traveled 11 hours, which, with the 2 hours given to resting and feeding the horses, made 13. They entered the town and stopped before the Hotel of Commerce. The carriage door opened. A well-known sound gave the travelers a start. It was the scabbard of a sword hitting the ground. Immediately a German voice was heard in the darkness. Although the diligence was not moving, no one offered to alight, fearing some one might be waiting to murder them as they stepped out. Then the conductor appeared, holding in his hand one of the lanterns which lighted the carriage to its depth, and showed the 2 rows of frightened faces, whose mouths were open and whose eyes were wide with surprise and fear. Outside, beside the driver, in plain sight, stood a German officer, an excessively tall young man, thin and blond, squeezed into his uniform like a girl in a corset, and wearing on his head a flat oilcloth cap which made him resemble the porter of an English hotel. His enormous mustache, of long straight hairs, growing gradually thin at each side and terminating in a single blond thread so fine that one could not perceive where it ended, seemed to weigh heavily on the corners of his mouth, and, drawing down the cheeks, left a decided wrinkle about the lips. In Alsatian French he invited the travelers to come in, saying in a suave tone, "Will you descend, gentlemen and ladies?" The 2 good sisters were the first to obey, with the docility of saints accustomed ever to submission. The Count and Countess then appeared, followed by the manufacturer and his wife. Then Lousseau, pushing ahead of him his larger half. The last named, as he set foot on the earth, said to the officer, "Good evening, sir," more as a measure of prudence than politeness. The officer, in